one, it says, when the first of Adar, new moon, falls on a Sabbath, the portion, Shekilem, is to be read. If it falls on any other day, that portion must be read on the preceding Sabbath, and nothing additional is read in the following Sabbath. So we find that these days can fall any day of the week. These annual Shabbaton days, these annual feasts, they could fall on any day of the week. And this has been in effect for many, many years. During the time of Christ, for sure, they were keeping the continual, unbroken 7-day cycle. Now, there was a Pentecost controversy. Some people don't even know about this Pentecost controversy, but there was a Pentecost controversy. It was between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And I'd like to notice a few things about this controversy. There was a controversy regarding what day that Pentecost should be kept. And I'd like to read a quote here from the Columbia Encyclopedia, article Sadducees. First of all, to tell you who the Sadducees were. The Sadducees were a sect of the Jews formed around the time of the Hasmonean revolt in 200 BC. Their sect was centered on the cult of the temple, and they ceased to exist after its destruction in AD 70. So you notice the Sadducees were in existence from 200 BC to 70 AD. That is when that time period of the Sadducees. And there was a debate going on about the Pentecost between the Sadducees and the Pharisees during Christ's time, where some were saying Pentecost should be celebrated on one day and some another. And the reason for this confusion was because some interpreted the word Sabbath in Leviticus 23 differently than others. Now, look at the this quote here. It says, regarding the biblical commandment to offer the omer, the wave sheaf, on the morrow after the Sabbath, the rabbis maintain that the Sabbath here means simply a day of rest and refers to Passover. The Sadducees, or Bethusians, disputed this interpretation, contending that the Sabbath meant Saturday. Accordingly, they would transfer the count of 7 weeks from the morrow of the first Saturday in Passover, so that Pentecost would always fall on Sunday. The Karaites accepted the Sadducees' view. Ibn Ezra Adlak argues against the contention of the Karaites and claims that as all other holy days have fixed days in the month, it would be unreasonable to suppose that Pentecost depended on a certain day of the week. That comes from the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, article Pentecost. So here we find there was a contention between the Sadducees and the Pharisees over what day they should keep Pentecost, because the Bible does not tell you what date the wave sheaf would be offered. It just says the day after the Sabbath. And the word Sabbath there is Shabbat. And since the 15th is not called a Shabbat, that it's very easy to understand why the Sadducees would say that this must be the Shabbat, the weekly Shabbat. And the fact that there was a contention at all proves that they were keeping a continually unbroken 7-day cycle during that time, during the time of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They had to have kept this 7-day continual cycle, or there would be no controversy. Because if the Sabbath all the time was the 15th of the month, then every time the wave sheaf would be offered on the 16th, and Pentecost would be 50 days from there and would fall on a specific date. And I want you to notice that the date for Pentecost is never given. There's no date given for Pentecost. Instead, they were to take from the time of the wave sheaf, they were to count 50 days to Pentecost. There is never a date given. And that fact alone shows us that the day of Pentecost would float on the calendar. It would not always be on the same day of the month. And that is why this very contention over Pentecost proves that they were keeping the 7-day cycle, continuous 7-day cycle from creation. Now I'd like to read from another quote here. It says, the expression, the morrow after the Sabbath, in Leviticus 23:11, has sometimes been misunderstood as implying that the presentation of the so-called first sheaf was to be always made on the day following the weekly Sabbath of the Passover week. This view, adopted by the Bethusians and the Sadducees in the time of Christ, and by the Karaite Jews and certain modern interpreters, rests on a misinterpretation of the word Sabbath. That's Alfred Edersheim, the temple, its ministry and services. Now, whether it's a misinterpretation of the word Sabbath or not, I'll let you check that out for yourself. I believe that the word Sabbath is Shabbat, and it's referring to the weekly Sabbath. Now here's another quote. The Sadducees offered the sheaf on the Sunday inside the Passover week, and while the Book of Jubilees held that the offering of the sheaf was celebrated on the first Sunday outside the Passover week, the Sadducees celebrated it on the Sunday inside the Passover week. And that comes from J.B. Sagel, The Hebrew Passover, pages 248 to 249. Now, I want to read another quote. We'll just continue reading quotes because there's so many of these on this Pentecost controversy. It says, as to the feast, the two parties differed in the manner of fixing the date of Pentecost. According to Leviticus 23:11 and 15, 7 full weeks had to be counted from the morrow after the Sabbath, upon which the priests waved the sheaf of firstfruits before the Lord. The Pharisees followed the traditional interpretation that the Sabbath meant the first day of the feast, and that consequently Pentecost might fall on any day of the week. The Sadducees, or rather, according to Schur, the Bethusians, a variety of the Sadducees, held that the Sabbath meant the weekly Sabbath, and that therefore Pentecost always fell on the first day of the week. That come from James Hastings' Dictionary of the Bible, page 351. So here we find that the Pharisees would keep Pentecost on any day of the week. Could it be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? Pentecost would fall any day of the week. But the Sadducees always kept it on the first day of the week. It was always the day after the Sabbath, which the Bible actually says in Leviticus 23 that the Pentecost was to be the day after the Shabbat, which is always the first day of the week. So let's continue. There's another quote here. The Sadducees celebrated it on the 50th day, which is inclusive reckoning, from the first Sunday after Passover, taking the Sabbath of Leviticus 23:15 to be the weekly Sabbath. Their reckoning regulated the public observance so long as the temple stood, and the church is therefore justified in commemorating the first Christian Pentecost on a Sunday, Whit Sunday. The Pharisees, however, interpreted the Sabbath of Leviticus 23:15 as the festival of unleavened bread, and their reckoning became normative in Judaism after AD 70, so that in the Jewish calendar, Pentecost now falls on various days of the week. That's from the New Bible Dictionary on the Feast of Pentecost. And another quote. This says, the date of the feast came to be firmly fixed only in later Judaism. It was now dated on the 50th day after the Passover. Opinions varied as to the significance of the day after the Sabbath, mentioned in Leviticus 23:15. The Bethusians, or Sadducees, took this literally and counted from the first regular Sabbath, Saturday, after the first day of the Passover, so that the Pentecost would always fall on a Sunday. The Pharisees, however, took the Sabbath of Leviticus 23:15 to mean the first day of the Passover, the 15th of Nisan, and thus counted 7 full weeks from the 16th of Nisan, so that Pentecost would fall exactly on the 50th day after the 16th of Nisan. According to this reckoning, the day of the week on which Pentecost came would depend on the day of the week the Passover began. That's the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the Jewish Feast of Pentecost. Now I'd like to read another quote. The Pharisees held that the time between... Oh, I'm sorry, I already read that. Forgive me. Oh, it's missing from my notes. The Pharisees held that the time between Easter, Passover, and Pentecost should be counted from the second day of the feast. The Sadducees insisted that it should commence with a literal Sabbath after the festive day. That's Alfred Edersheim, Sketches of the Jewish Social Life, page 220. So what we find is there was a contention, a controversy over the Pentecost, what day they should keep it, and this controversy was raging from the time 200 BC to 70 AD, during the time of the Sadducees. And this controversy could not possibly have existed if they were keeping a lunar Sabbath. It would be impossible for there to be a Pentecost controversy if the wave sheaf was always on the 16th of the month, if Sabbath was always the 15th of the month, then there could possibly be no controversy over the day of Pentecost. The very fact that there was a controversy over Pentecost proves